from prosperity to ruin in a single lifetime. When mysterious warriors with horned helmets swept across the Mediterranean in 1177 BC, they didn't just raid, they shattered civilization itself. Watch as mighty empires crumble, Mycenaean palaces burning, Hittite kings abandoning their capitals, and desperate letters from doomed cities begging for help that never came. Experience Ramesses III's desperate defense of Egypt against an invasion that included not just warriors, but entire families seeking new homes. Though defeated at the Nile, these sea peoples would transform into new powers. Philistines, Phoenicians, reshaping history after destroying the Bronze Age world. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the world of the late Bronze Age gleamed with wealth and splendor. Great palaces rose from fertile valleys, temples glimmered with gold, and fleets of merchant ships stitched together kingdoms separated by sea and desert. This was not an age of isolated realms, but of intricate connections. The kings of Egypt, the lords of Anatolia, the warriors of Mycenae, and the merchants of Canaan all bound themselves into a fragile yet glittering system that depended on trust, trade, and power. In the south, the Nile carried the lifeblood of Egypt. Pharaohs presided over vast storehouses filled with grain, linen, and crafted goods. To the east, beyond the deserts of Sinai, lay Canaan, with its bustling city-states, small but vital links in the chain of Mediterranean commerce. Cyprus, rich in copper, stood at the center of maritime exchange. Northward stretched the domains of Ugarit and Byblos, wealthy ports that relayed cargoes between inland empires and the open sea. Farther still loomed the kingdom of the Hittites, whose capital at Hattusa commanded the mountain passes of Anatolia. From Greece to Mesopotamia, caravans and galleys carried the resources of this world. Bronze, the very metal that named the age, depended on the marriage of copper and tin. Copper came in steady streams from the mines of Cyprus, while tin traveled from distant and uncertain lands. Perhaps Afghanistan, perhaps the mountains of Anatolia, perhaps even further west. Without both, swords dulled, plows broke, and armies faltered. So every king kept a wary eye on the trade routes, ensuring that the twin lifebloods of their age reached the palace workshops. Ships sailed laden with more than just metal. Amphorae filled with wine clinked together in dark holds. Jars of oil, fragrant with herbs, stood beside baskets of dried fish. Linen and wool garments traveled beside blocks of ebony and ivory from Africa. Lapis, lazuli, turquoise, and carnelian adorned queens and priestesses in courts from Memphis to Mycenae. Ivory combs, inlaid daggers, and gold goblets testified to the taste for luxury that unified these elites. Even the letters they wrote were part of this web. Clay tablets carried across borders in diplomatic packets, sealed with royal names and filled with promises of friendship. Marriage, too, bound these realms together. Pharaohs took foreign princesses as wives, and daughters of Egyptian kings were dispatched to Hittite courts. These dynastic unions stitched political alliances into the very fabric of family. When disputes arose, they were as likely to be argued in letters dripping with royal courtesy as on the battlefield. The Amarna tablets, discovered centuries later, preserved the voices of kings calling each other brother and sending lavish gifts of gold, horses, and ivory as tokens of goodwill. Yet beneath the brilliance of this world lay fragility. Each realm depended not only on its own harvests and mines, but on the steady flow of goods from abroad. A failed crop in Anatolia meant hunger in Canaan. A pirate raid in the Aegean delayed shipments of tin. An earthquake could level a city that supplied vital stores of grain. The very interconnection that sustained prosperity also spread danger. Storms of trouble already brewed at the edges. In the Aegean, migrations unsettled coastlines and islands. Waves of people shifted from one shore to another, pushed by hunger, conflict, or opportunity. Archaeologists later uncovered layers of burned palaces, abandoned settlements, and scattered hordes that spoke of sudden violence and desperate flight. Earthquakes, too, rattled the earth, toppling walls and silencing once bustling harbours. On the Anatolian coasts, restless seafarers appeared in Egyptian records, raiders whose origins were uncertain, but whose impact was unmistakable. They struck suddenly, plundering cargoes and vanishing into the waves. In time, these wandering bands would be remembered as the first shadows of the peoples who would bring empires crashing down. For now, they were whispers in the wind, warnings that not all was secure in this shining world. Still, kings clung to the old patterns. Supplicants from Canaan bowed before Pharaoh in gilded halls, pledging loyalty in exchange for Egyptian troops. Hittite chariots rumbled across the plains of Syria to secure tribute. Mycenaean warlords carved their strength into stone citadels, filling storerooms with jars of oil and wine destined for trade. Every power seemed unshakable, every empire eternal. Yet the system was stretched taut, like a ship's rigging, straining against rising winds. Among ordinary people, life reflected both the reach of empire and the vulnerabilities of the age. Farmers in Canaan delivered grain not only to their local lords, but to Egyptian garrisons stationed along the coast. Shepherds in Cyprus bartered wool for imported luxuries from the east. Fishermen in Ugarit pulled nets heavy with sardines, while merchants bargained over amphorae of Levantine wine. Their world was rich but dependent, always subject to the needs and wars of kings far away. Diplomacy offered some protection. Treaties etched into stone or baked into clay declared boundaries, tributes, and mutual defense. Vassal states promised loyalty in exchange for protection, while great powers swore brotherhood. Yet behind the polished words lurked suspicion. Pharaohs measured every tribute from their Canaanite lords to ensure obedience. Hittite kings monitored the loyalty of Western Anatolia with constant patrols. Mycenaean rulers, though often excluded from the great brotherhood of Near Eastern kings, projected their presence through trade and warfare, making themselves impossible to ignore. As the 13th century BC approached, pressure intensified. Grain became harder to secure in Anatolia, while in Greece, some palaces struggled with unrest. Droughts, hinted at by later scientific studies of tree rings and sediments, may have weakened harvests across the region. When food grew scarce, debts piled up, and when debts mounted, peasants rebelled or fled. This instability often showed itself first at the fringes: small-scale migrations, new bands of warriors, traders who doubled as pirates. And so, while the great courts of Memphis, Hattusa, Mycenae, and Ugarit still glittered with gold and echoed with music, their world balanced on a knife's edge. No single collapse had yet occurred, no empire yet destroyed, but the signs multiplied. Raiders pressed closer to the coasts. Earthquakes left cracks in palace walls. Letters grew more desperate, demanding grain or soldiers from allies. The stage was set. A world of splendor stretched across the Mediterranean, its powers interlocked in webs of trade, diplomacy, and ambition. But just beyond the horizon, unseen forces gathered. Wanderers from unknown shores, restless seafarers, and displaced peoples would soon converge. When they did, the fragile balance of the late Bronze Age would shatter, and the sea peoples, the empire breakers, would step onto the stage of history. Long before their armies clashed with Egypt, the people later called the Sea Peoples lived as shadows in legend and whispers in foreign records. Where they came from remains one of history's most enduring riddles. Scholars, even today, debate whether they first rose from the islands of the Aegean, from the rugged coasts of Anatolia, or even from the distant shores of Sardinia and Italy. In the centuries before their great invasion, hints of their movements flickered across the Mediterranean like sparks before a storm. One clue lies in the names preserved by Egyptian scribes. Among them were the Sherden, Shekelesh, Luca, Peleset, Tjeker, and Denyen. Each carried echoes of languages and lands scattered across the sea. Some sound strikingly similar to groups remembered in later ages. The Luca resemble the Lycians of Anatolia. The Denyen call to mind the Danaans of Homer's epic verse, while the Peleset may be ancestors of the Philistines who appear in biblical traditions. Though the exact connections remain elusive, these names suggest a patchwork of tribes and clans bound less by a single homeland than by a shared life upon the water. The ruins themselves speak to this. Across the Aegean, the mighty palaces that once dominated Greece began to show signs of strain. At sites like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Thebes, layers of ash reveal fires that consumed storerooms and halls. Abandoned homes, hastily buried hoards of weapons, and toppled walls hint at turmoil. Some disasters may have sprung from earthquakes, others from rebellion or foreign attack. Whatever the cause, by the 13th century BC, many communities in the region were restless, and displaced peoples began to drift outward across the seas. This period of upheaval echoes strangely in later Greek myth. After the fall of Troy, Homer tells of wandering heroes who could not return home. Odysseus drifted from island to island, encountering strange peoples and hostile shores. Menelaus journeyed to distant Egypt before regaining Sparta. Such tales, though written down centuries later, may preserve faint memories of real movements. Bands of displaced warriors, cut loose from their homelands, forced to carve out new lives wherever the wind carried them. Meanwhile, Egyptian texts add their own pieces to the puzzle. As early as the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, records mention foreigners serving as mercenaries in his armies. Sherden warriors, once feared as raiders, appear in Egyptian reliefs not only as enemies, but also as guards in the pharaoh's own household. Their horned helmets and round shields made them distinctive figures, recognizable even in stone carvings. The transformation from pirate to bodyguard reveals both the danger and the skill of these peoples. Men who could threaten the Nile Delta one year and defend the throne the next. In western Anatolia, the Luca grew infamous for piracy. Coastal settlements endured constant raids, and Hittite letters speak of the difficulty of keeping them under control. Despite repeated campaigns, the central power in Hattusa struggled to maintain order along its western frontier. The persistence of such unrest created fertile ground for migration, as restless warriors looked beyond their homelands for wealth and survival. Italy and Sardinia also play a role in these mysteries. The Sherden, with their round shields and horned helmets, bear a striking resemblance to warriors depicted in Nuragic Sardinia. Archaeologists have uncovered stone towers, known as nuraghe, that dot the island's hills, fortresses that suggest a culture accustomed to both defense and seaborne rivalry. The Shekelesh, too, may trace connections to Sicily, where warrior traditions and coastal fortifications flourished in this same era. Though conclusive proof remains out of reach, the similarities fuel the idea that Western Mediterranean groups joined the great wave that later struck the East. What unites all these scattered threads is movement. Whether from the Aegean, Anatolia, or further west, families and fighters were on the move. Some were driven by famine, others by conquest, others still by opportunity. To men who had lost their fields, plunder across the sea promised survival. To younger sons denied inheritance, the sword and ship offered a new beginning. To exiles and mercenaries, allegiance shifted easily. Today a pirate, tomorrow a guard in the pharaoh's court. These migrations did not happen in isolation. As raiders pushed outward, they encountered the established powers of the late Bronze Age. The Egyptians saw them first as threats, then as useful warriors. The Hittites struggled to suppress them, but also employed them when necessity demanded. The city-states of Canaan, caught between empires, likely felt their presence in raids upon coastal trade. Step by step, these wandering groups became entwined with the very powers they would later help to destroy. Among ordinary people, the rumors of such wanderers carried both fear and fascination. Farmers in Cyprus heard of foreign ships that swept into harbors without warning. Merchants in Ugarit worried about cargoes lost at sea. Egyptian villagers watched strange warriors paraded through the streets. Prisoners 1 year, soldiers the next. Over time, the memory of these encounters grew into legend, stories told around fires of men from far-off lands who could appear like a storm and vanish just as swiftly. Thus, by the middle of the 13th century BC, the ingredients of catastrophe were already present. Displaced populations roamed the seas, palaces in the Aegean lay in ruins. Anatolia's frontiers trembled, and Egypt had already begun to taste both the threat and the service of these strangers. Myths spoke of wandering heroes, inscriptions recorded pirate raids, and archaeology preserved the ashes of destroyed towns. The precise homeland of the sea peoples may never be fixed to one place, for they were not born of a single soil. They were the children of upheaval, forged in the collapse of palaces, the hunger of failed harvests, and the ambition of restless warlords. Their ships carried not just goods, but entire communities, families, warriors, and chieftains bound together by necessity. When they first appeared in force, they were not yet the coalition remembered in Egyptian reliefs. They were fragments of many worlds, Greek, Anatolian, Sardinian, Sicilian, drawn together by fate and survival. Their origins lay in scattered lands, but their destiny would be shared, to challenge the greatest empires of their age, and forever change the map of the ancient Mediterranean. The glittering network of the late Bronze Age had not yet collapsed, but cracks had begun to spread across its foundations. As the 13th century BC opened, whispers of wandering raiders hardened into real encounters. Along the Nile Delta, on the coasts of Anatolia, and across the islands of the Aegean, new figures appeared. Restless seafarers who plundered, traded, and offered their swords to whichever king paid best. They were still only fragments of what would later be called the Sea Peoples, but their presence was already enough to unsettle empires. Egyptian records from this era describe these strangers with striking clarity. The Sherden, among the earliest named, were remembered first as pirates. They swooped upon merchant convoys with speed and precision, leaving chaos in their wake. Reliefs carved into temple walls show them with horned helmets, round shields, and long swords, distinctive enough that even centuries later their image stood out. For all their ferocity, the pharaohs soon found it wiser to employ them rather than destroy them. Captured Sherden were settled in Egypt, some serving as personal bodyguards to the king himself. To see once dreaded raiders guarding the throne illustrated both the danger they posed and the value they offered. Beyond Egypt, the Luca carved their reputation along Anatolia's rugged coastline. Hittite letters complain bitterly of their constant piracy. Merchant ships bound for Ugarit or Cyprus lived in fear of their sudden attacks. Despite repeated military campaigns, the kings of Hattusa could never fully suppress them. Even when defeated in open battle, they regrouped quickly, slipping back into hidden coves and fortified harbors. Their raids disrupted not only commerce, but also diplomacy. For every lost shipment meant broken promises and strained alliances. This growing unrest was tied closely to the weakening of older powers. Mycenaean Greece, once a steady partner in trade, began to show signs of decline. Some of its palaces suffered fire, others rebellion, leaving gaps in the maritime routes they once controlled. These disruptions created opportunity for the wandering raiders. Ships that once carried wine and oil under royal seal now sailed unprotected, tempting prizes for those skilled enough to take them. Pharaohs responded with both force and pragmatism. Military campaigns struck against pirate bands when they grew too bold, but at the same time, mercenaries were hired into the very armies that fought them. It was a dangerous gamble. By granting them service, Egypt gained soldiers who fought with courage and skill. Yet the risk remained that loyalty bought with gold could vanish if another lord offered more. Still, necessity drove the kings to accept the bargain. The frontiers of empire stretched too far, the threats too numerous, to ignore the chance of turning raiders into allies. The dual nature of these foreigners, enemies in one season, protectors in the next, made them both feared and respected. Egyptian villagers must have watched with awe and unease as Sherden marched through temple precincts, no longer in chains, but in gleaming armor beside the pharaoh. In Anatolia, merchants cursed the lucre as pirates, even as some rulers courted them with offers of land or silver. This ambiguity defined the age. The same men who plundered could also be trusted with the defense of a throne. As the raiders grew more prominent, the Mediterranean itself seemed to change character. What had once been a web of secure routes now felt uncertain. Captains sailed with heavier guards, and ports built watchtowers along their shores. Farmers in coastal valleys heard rumors of strange ships appearing on the horizon. At night, fires from raids flickered across the water, reminders that danger was never far away. Yet not all encounters were violent. Some wandering bands offered themselves directly as mercenaries, selling their skills without first drawing blood. In this way, they slipped into the armies of Egypt, the Hittite Empire, and even the city-states of Canaan. They learned the tactics of chariot warfare, the rhythms of Egyptian drill, and the complexities of siegecraft. In doing so, they became more dangerous still. By absorbing the techniques of their employers, they ensured that when the time came to stand against those same powers, they would do so with knowledge equal to any army. Evidence of their early service survives in inscriptions and reliefs. A papyrus from Egypt tells of foreign guards stationed at garrisons along the delta. Hittite records speak of men of the sea enlisted for coastal campaigns. Even the kings of small Levantine towns turned to them in moments of crisis. Each new engagement deepened their integration into the political world of the age, while also spreading their influence and numbers further across the region. Behind these shifts lay broader forces. Drought in Anatolia strained supplies, while earthquakes unsettled the Aegean. Displaced peoples searched for sustenance, and many found it easier to seize what they needed by sea. The breakdown of Mycenaean trade and the weakness of certain Hittite provinces created opportunities too tempting to resist. In this environment, piracy was not merely crime, but a means of survival, and mercenary service a path to security. For ordinary subjects of the empires, these years must have felt unstable. A caravan could be plundered before reaching its destination. A fishing village might wake to foreign sails on the horizon. Soldiers stationed in garrisons discovered that their comrades could include men whose fathers once raided the very same shores. Trust blurred, and loyalty became something purchased rather than assumed. Despite the unrest, life carried on. Temples continued their rituals, harvests were brought in, and merchants risked the sea because trade remained the only lifeline of kingdoms. Yet beneath the daily routine ran a current of unease. Everyone knew that the seas were no longer safe, that foreign warriors lurked beyond the horizon. As the decades passed, the raiders became more organized. Bands that once acted alone began to form coalitions. Shared experiences in mercenary service gave them common tactics, while intermarriage and migration blended their peoples. What began as isolated piracy now hinted at something larger, a movement of peoples, not just warriors, sweeping across the Mediterranean. The storm had not yet broken. Egypt still held its wealth, the Hittites their empire, and the palaces of the Aegean still stood in stone. But the presence of the raiders marked a shift. No longer mere shadows, they were a force to be reckoned with. Pharaohs and kings could not dismiss them, for they were both threat and necessity. By the early 12th century BC, these groups had become entwined with the fate of every empire in the region. Their raids weakened trade, their service altered armies, and their migrations destabilized borders. Though not yet united, they were the seeds of the great invasion to come. The storm clouds had gathered. What began as scattered piracy and mercenary service would soon swell into waves of destruction that no empire could withstand. Stone citadels crowned the hills of Greece in the 13th century BC. Massive walls of Mycenaean, Pylos, and Tiryns spoke of power and permanence. Their gates decorated with lions and their storerooms brimming with oil, wine, and precious metals. Within these fortresses, rulers held sway over vast territories, commanding chariots, scribes, and artisans. For generations they had prospered, linking their palaces into the great exchange system that bound Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant. Yet in little more than a single lifetime, this shining world would vanish. The signs of collapse first appeared in destruction. Across the ruins, layers of ash and broken stone told the same story of destruction. At Pylos, once a thriving seat of administration, fire consumed entire archives of clay tablets. Scribes had pressed lists of rations and inventories into the wet clay, only hours before flames engulfed the building, preserving a final snapshot of a system unraveling. At Tiryns and Mycenae itself, walls were breached, halls toppled, and treasures scattered. Some sites show evidence of earthquake damage, others of invasion, and still others of internal revolt. Linear B, the script used to record the workings of palace bureaucracy, fell silent with this destruction. For centuries, scribes had documented shipments of grain, allocations of bronze, and offerings to the gods. When their tablets ceased, the centralized economy they managed collapsed with them. Without the palaces to collect surplus and direct labor, the intricate web of Mycenaean society fractured. Farmers returned to subsistence, artisans lost patrons, and warriors without leaders sought fortune elsewhere. The collapse of these citadels created not only ruin, but also waves of displacement. Families fled the burning palaces, carrying what they could. Warriors, stripped of service to kings who no longer ruled, banded together in search of new lands. Some settled in smaller fortified villages, but many turned their eyes across the sea. Ships became lifelines for survival, carrying both refugees and ambitious chieftains. From these wanderers came new movements that rippled outward, joining the wider currents of upheaval already stirring the Mediterranean. Echoes of this turmoil found their way into legend. Centuries later, Greek poets would sing of a great war at Troy, where kings and heroes fought for glory and survival. Whether the Trojan conflict reflects a single historical event or a blend of many, the themes resonate with the realities of the 13th century BC, burning cities, displaced warriors, and long journeys by sea. The Odyssey's tale of a hero adrift mirrors the fate of countless men and women forced from their homes by disaster. In myth, as in history, the collapse of the palaces unleashed both tragedy and wandering. The loss of Mycenaean stability also destabilized neighboring regions. Trade routes that once carried olive oil and wine eastward grew unreliable. Egypt and the Hittites, dependent on these goods, felt the shock. Merchants in Cyprus and the Levant found their regular partners gone, forcing them to seek new suppliers or confront empty harbors. Even small disruptions reverberated across the interconnected Bronze Age system, multiplying the strain on already fragile powers. For the Mycenaeans themselves, the collapse was total. Once proud citadels became ruins inhabited only by squatters. Grand Tholos tombs, where kings had been buried with gold masks and weapons, stood empty or looted. Skills once cultivated in palace workshops, fine fresco painting, advanced metalwork, precise record keeping, diminished or disappeared. The knowledge of writing itself faded from memory, plunging Greece into centuries of silence until a new alphabet would later emerge. Not all the survivors lingered among the ruins. Some steered their ships across the waters to Crete, Cyprus, and the Levant. The pottery they carried, the closing chapter of Mycenaean craftsmanship, shaped in an age of upheaval, appears in distant harbours, marking the journey of those who had left behind kingdoms for life as wanderers. These displaced communities carried their culture with them. Distinctive pottery styles, architectural traditions, and weapons that blended with those of local populations. It was within this mass of displaced warriors and families that the seeds of the Sea People's movements took root. Men trained in palace armies, skilled with sword and spear, no longer found steady service in their homeland. Stripped of pay and patronage, they turned to raiding. Families followed, turning these groups into not only war bands, but entire migrating peoples. In this way, the fall of the Mycenaean world directly fed the rising tide that would soon batter Egypt, Hatti, and Canaan. The destruction was not confined to mainland Greece. Crete, long a hub of Aegean culture, also suffered. Palatial centres such as Knossos had already waned earlier, but in this century, remaining strongholds faced fire and abandonment. Islands once connected by dense trade networks fell into isolation. Without the Mycenaean fleets to bind them, the Aegean fractured into small, struggling communities. This domino effect was unmistakable. With Greece in turmoil, Anatolia faced added pressure on its western coast. The Hittite Empire struggled to maintain its grip over rebellious vassals, and now faced waves of migrants seeking land and security. Cyprus, once a steady supplier of copper, found itself caught between demand from the great powers and raids from displaced peoples. The Levant, dotted with vulnerable city-states, became both refuge and target. Each region felt the shock of Greece's collapse as if a stone had been cast into the heart of the Mediterranean, sending ripples in every direction. In the memory of later ages, this period stood as a dark turning point. The grand halls of the Mycenaean kings became ruins visited by shepherds. Oral tradition preserved fragments of their glory, transmuted into epic poetry centuries later. But for those who lived through the collapse, the experience was not legend, but survival. Each family faced choices: stay among ruins, migrate inland, or risk the sea in search of safer shores. Many chose the last, and their voyages joined the swelling tide of restless peoples who would later shake the foundations of the ancient world. Thus ended the age of the palaces in Greece. What had been mighty kingdoms, adorned with frescoes and governed by scribes, dissolved into scattered villages. In their place rose a different order, smaller, harder, more mobile. The fall of Mycenaean civilization was not merely the loss of wealth, but the release of energy, scattering peoples across the Mediterranean. In that scattering lay the making of the sea peoples, the empire breakers who would soon rise to prominence. In the heart of Anatolia, the citadel of Hattusa had long stood as the proud center of the Hittite world. Its walls, hewn from stone and timber, climbed steep hillsides, enclosing temples, palaces, and storehouses. From this fortress, kings had ruled for centuries, their authority stretching across mountains, rivers, and fertile plains. At their height, they commanded lands from the Aegean coast to the valleys of Syria, from the Black Sea to the borders of Mesopotamia. Yet by the dawn of the 12th century BC, this empire faced storms it could no longer master. The last of the strong monarchs, Suppiluliuma II, inherited a kingdom already strained. Letters from his reign reveal constant troubles, vassals wavering in loyalty, crops failing in crucial provinces, and foreign raiders pressing on every frontier. His armies still marched, but the ground beneath them was fragile. Victories in battle did not restore grain to empty granaries or rebuild burned-out towns. Coastal regions proved especially vulnerable. The Lucca, already notorious for piracy, grew bolder. Bands of Sherden and other sea raiders joined them, striking harbors from western Anatolia to Cyprus. Naval engagements flared as Hittite fleets sought to defend supply routes. Reliefs and texts describe desperate clashes at sea, ships ramming one another, warriors leaping across decks with sword and shield. For a kingdom accustomed to land battles fought with chariots on open plains, these maritime conflicts proved costly and unfamiliar. While the navy struggled, inland provinces suffered their own miseries. Droughts reduced harvests, and caravans from Syria failed to arrive. Clay tablets preserved in the ruins of Ugarit, a Hittite ally, plead for grain. One desperate letter, never sent because the city fell before messengers could depart, cried out for immediate shipments of food. Such pleas reveal the thin line between survival and collapse. In the west, rebellion flared. Tarhuntasa, a rival Hittite center once loyal to the crown, broke away under pressure from foreign raids and local dissent. This loss not only weakened imperial control, but also fractured the very identity of the Hittite state. Where once unity had been imposed by kings and treaties, now local lords looked to their own defense, abandoning the broader system. The empire's diplomatic reach also shrank. Egypt, once a cautious partner, now faced its own troubles and could no longer offer aid. The fading Mycenaean world, once both rival and ally, had collapsed into ruin. To the east, Assyria rose in power, pressing into territories once held by Hatti. Surrounded on all sides, the empire that had dominated Anatolia for centuries now seemed an island beset by storms. Life within Hattusa itself mirrored the empire's decline. Excavations reveal hurried attempts at rebuilding walls, the stockpiling of supplies, and the construction of makeshift fortifications. Temples that once received lavish offerings stood less adorned. Administrative records dwindled, suggesting that the bureaucracy itself faltered. Citizens must have felt the strain daily. Shortages of food, uncertainty about defense, and rumors of enemies gathering at the gates. Still, Suppiluliuma II fought on. He launched campaigns against coastal raiders, won victories, and claimed success in inscriptions. His determination reflected the resilience of a dynasty that had weathered many storms before. But even victories proved hollow. For every defeat of one band of raiders was followed by the rise of another. The waves of displaced peoples, swelling from the Aegean and beyond, could not be stopped by force alone. The empire's reliance on long supply lines made it especially vulnerable. Armies in Syria depended on grain shipped from Anatolia, but when harvests failed and coasts grew dangerous, soldiers starved. Garrisons mutinied or abandoned their posts. Towns once guarded by imperial troops found themselves defenseless. One by one, Hittite strongholds in the south and west fell silent, consumed by fire or simply abandoned. When Hattusa finally succumbed, it did so amid silence. No dramatic record survives of its fall, no triumphant inscription by conquerors. Instead, the land speaks. Burned walls, shattered statues, and deserted streets. The city that had once dominated an empire was left empty, its archives baked into clay by fire, its temples toppled, its royal line extinguished. By 1180 BC, the empire of the Hittites was gone. For the surrounding world, this collapse carried profound consequences. Without Hittite power to guard Anatolia and Syria, raiders moved freely. The balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean shifted dramatically. Assyria pressed further west, while Egyptian influence in the Levant grew more precarious. The trade routes that once passed safely through Anatolia and northern Syria now lay exposed to attack, cutting another thread from the fabric of the late Bronze Age system. Ordinary people bore the weight of these events most heavily. Farmers abandoned fertile valleys when armies no longer defended them. Refugees streamed towards safer lands, joining the swelling tide of migrants that carried both desperation and ambition. Some of these displaced families merged with the very raiders who haunted the seas, providing numbers and supplies for their ventures. In this way, the fall of the Hittites not only marked the end of an empire, but also added fuel to the larger movement that would culminate in the Sea People's Great Assault. Memory of Hatti faded swiftly. Later Assyrian and biblical texts scarcely recalled its former might. What had once been one of the great powers of the Bronze Age became a whisper, its ruins scattered among Anatolian hills. Yet for those who lived through the empire's last years, the reality was stark. Famine, flight, and ruin. The destruction of Hattusa did not mark the end of Catastrophe. To the south, the wealthy port of Ugarit soon faced its own doom, struck down by the same forces that had harried the Hittites. There, in the final desperate letters of a king pleading for aid, the collapse of an age would be written in clay for future generations to read. On the northern coast of Syria, where fertile valleys met the open sea, lay the city of Ugarit. Its harbours bustled with trade. Its markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the Mediterranean. Merchants of Cyprus docked ships heavy with copper. Caravans from Mesopotamia brought fine textiles, and Egyptian envoys arrived with papyrus and gold. For centuries, Ugarit had thrived as an intermediary, its scribes fluent in multiple languages, its kings balancing diplomacy with powerful neighbours. Yet in the final years of the 13th century BC, the city stood at the edge of ruin. The evidence of its last days survives in haunting detail. In the ruins lay archives of tablets, still soft, deserted in the frenzy of ruin. These letters, etched in cuneiform, reveal desperate pleas. One message from Amurapi, the last known king of Ugarit, begs his overlord for aid, grain for starving citizens, soldiers to hold back enemies. Another letter, written to a nearby ally, warns of hostile ships sighted off the coast. The messenger who carried it never departed. The tablet remained in the ruins, testimony to a cry for help unanswered. Simultaneous pressures bore down on the city. Raiders struck from the sea, their vessels swift and numerous. Earthquakes rattled the ground, toppling walls and spreading terror. Famine followed poor harvests, compounding misery. In such conditions, even a wealthy port could not endure for long. Without steady shipments of grain from Anatolia and security from the Hittites, Ugarit's prosperity evaporated. Excavations show the violence of the end. Ash layers cover once busy streets. Storerooms filled with amphorae collapsed under fire. Homes were abandoned with goods still inside, as though families fled in haste. Workshops lay silent, half-finished goods on their floors. Nothing suggests a planned evacuation or orderly surrender, only sudden destruction. The fall of Ugarit was not an isolated tragedy. Across the Levant, ports and cities suffered similar fates. Alalak, Byblos, and Ashkelon all felt the weight of invasion and disruption. Where once ships departed daily, harbors fell quiet. Trade that linked east and west collapsed, cutting off Egypt from Anatolian copper, Assyria from Mediterranean timber, and countless small towns from the goods they relied on. The sea peoples were both symptom and cause of this wider collapse. Driven by hunger and displacement, they descended upon the Levant not merely as raiders, but as entire migrating communities. Families traveled alongside warriors, their ships carrying livestock, tools, and supplies. When they attacked, they aimed not only for plunder, but also for settlement. The burning of cities cleared the way for their resettlement along coasts once dominated by ancient states. For the citizens of Ugarit, the terror must have been overwhelming. Imagine the view from the city walls. Sails on the horizon, black against the sun. The sound of horns and drums. Fire arrows streaking toward the harbor. Soldiers, already weakened by famine and poor morale, could not withstand a determined assault. Families crowded temples seeking divine protection. Scribes scratched final tablets of warning, and merchants tried to hide their wealth. When the walls fell, the city's long history ended in fire. In the aftermath, silence spread across the northern Levant. Without Ugarit, the entire balance of Mediterranean trade shifted. Copper from Cyprus no longer flowed eastward with ease. Egyptian shipments to Syria dwindled, cutting ties that had lasted centuries. Assyrian merchants, long dependent on Syrian ports, found themselves stranded inland. The network that once supported prosperity across 3 continents broke apart. The destruction also carried cultural consequences. Ugarit had been a beacon of learning, home to a unique alphabetic script that simplified writing compared to complex cuneiform systems. Its scribes recorded myths, prayers, and hymns that revealed the gods of Canaanite tradition. El, Baal, Anat, and others, who later echoed in biblical literature. With the city's fall, this tradition nearly vanished, preserved only in buried archives that lay undiscovered until modern times. Beyond the walls, displaced survivors joined the tide of migrants sweeping south. Some may have been absorbed into the wandering bands that Egypt later fought. Others sought refuge in smaller Levantine towns or inland villages, their presence strained resources and heightened tensions, fueling further instability. For Egypt, the collapse of Ugarit sounded an alarm. Pharaohs depended on the Levantine ports to secure their northern frontier and provide timber for shipbuilding. With those cities gone, Egypt stood exposed to the very raiders who had destroyed them. The desperate letters of Amurapi, though unanswered in their own time, foreshadowed the storms that would soon crash directly upon the Nile Delta. From the perspective of the wider world, Ugarit's destruction marked the end of an era. The late Bronze Age had been defined by interconnectedness, trade, diplomacy, and the flow of goods and ideas across great distances. When one city fell, others could adapt. But when Ugarit and its neighbors collapsed in quick succession, the system itself crumbled. No single kingdom possessed the strength to rebuild it, and those who might have tried, the Hittites, Egypt, or Mycenaean Greece, were themselves beset by crisis. The ruins of Ugarit remain eloquent in their silence. Streets once alive with merchants and scribes lie buried under layers of ash. In storerooms, jars still stand where they fell, never touched again by human hands. The clay tablets, frozen mid-sentence, preserve the voices of a city at the very moment of its death. Few other sites from antiquity capture so vividly the collapse of an age. And yet, Ugarit's end was not unique. The story repeated itself along the Levantine coast. Sudden attacks, fires, abandonment, and the reshaping of entire societies. From this devastation emerged new peoples and new powers. The sea peoples, settling in the ruins, became part of the Iron Age world that would follow. Phoenician traders, rising from surviving towns, would soon dominate maritime commerce. Israelite tribes, Philistine settlers, and Aramean migrants would carve their places from the wreckage. The destruction of Ugarit stands, therefore, as both an ending and a beginning. It marked the death of a cosmopolitan city whose merchants once touched every corner of the Mediterranean. But it also signaled the birth of a new order, one forged in fire and migration. The old system, dependent on kings and treaties, was gone. In its place would come a harsher, more fragmented world, yet one brimming with new possibilities. As Egypt looked northward at smoking ruins and refugees flooding south, it could no longer deny the scale of the threat. The sea peoples had grown beyond piracy, beyond mercenary service. They were a force of migration, war, and settlement. Their next target would not be a port or ally, but the empire of the pharaohs themselves. When Ramesses II rose to Egypt's throne, the empire still stood as a colossus astride the eastern Mediterranean. His reign would stretch more than 6 decades, long enough to earn him the title the Great. Temples of stone bore his image in colossal form. Inscriptions praised his victories, and monuments across Nubia, Canaan, and the Nile Delta proclaimed Egypt's strength. Yet beneath the glory of his achievements lay growing challenges, and among them appeared the first recorded clashes with the wandering seafarers who would later be known as the Sea Peoples. The delta, fertile and crisscrossed with rivers and marshes, was both Egypt's breadbasket and its front line. Here, foreign ships often ventured too close, threatening trade and stability. Among them were the Sherden, who would become infamous in Egyptian records. At first, they appeared as raiders, their swift vessels cutting through the Mediterranean waves to plunder coastal towns and intercept merchant convoys. Egyptian scribes described them as fierce warriors, armed with round shields and horned helmets, their long swords flashing in battle. One of Ramesses's early campaigns brought them to public notice. Reliefs carved into temple walls at Karnak and other sites show naval clashes in which Egyptian ships, powered by rowers, rammed into enemy craft. Arrows rained down, while warriors leapt across decks, swords drawn. Captured Sherden were paraded before the pharaoh, bound and disarmed, yet still depicted as formidable opponents. To have their likeness carved into stone was both a record of triumph and a recognition of their growing menace. Yet Ramesses proved pragmatic. Rather than simply slaughtering his captives, he turned some into allies. Sherden warriors, once enemies on the sea, soon served as bodyguards in the pharaoh's own court. Egyptian texts proudly note their incorporation, presenting it as evidence of the king's power to tame and command even the fiercest of foes. For ordinary Egyptians, the sight of these foreigners guarding palaces must have been unsettling. A reminder that the same men who had once burned villages now stood within the heart of royal power. These encounters with the Sherden reveal both Egypt's strength and its vulnerabilities. On land, Egypt remained dominant. Ramesses secured Canaan, fought the Hittites to a standstill at Kadesh, and built temples that proclaimed his might. But at sea, the picture was different. The Nile's warriors were less accustomed to naval warfare, and the rise of organized seaborne raiders posed a new kind of threat. Victory in individual battles did not eliminate the problem, for new ships always appeared on the horizon. Meanwhile, the Hittites pressed from the north. Ramesses's famous battle at Kadesh against King Muwatalli showed the limits of Egyptian expansion. Though both sides claimed victory, the confrontation ended in a stalemate. Eventually, Egypt and Hatti forged a peace treaty, sealed with dynastic marriages. Yet even as the great empires balanced one another, the smaller, more elusive threat of the Sea Peoples continued. Neither treaty nor diplomacy could contain them, for they answered to no throne and carried no royal seal. In Egypt's own records, Ramesses's victories over the Sherden were presented as final, decisive, and total. Yet history and later inscriptions prove otherwise. Raids continued, and the Sherden reappeared in Egyptian service during later reigns. Their assimilation into the pharaoh's guard was both a triumph and an admission. Egypt could not fully expel them, only redirect their strength. Life in Egypt during these years reflected the paradox of glory and strain. In Thebes and Memphis, temples rose with colossal statues of the king, their walls covered in scenes of battle and divine favor. In Canaan, Egyptian garrisons extracted tribute from local rulers, ensuring loyalty. Farmers in the delta reaped harvests under the watch of soldiers, while scribes tallied grain for the royal granaries. To the casual observer, the empire appeared unshakable. Yet behind the scenes, cracks widened. Maintaining armies in Canaan drained resources. Building monumental temples consumed wealth. And each new raid along the coast reminded Egyptians that their power was not absolute. The assimilation of Sherden into Egyptian ranks also shaped the empire's culture. Reliefs and texts portray them not as slaves, but as honored guards, their distinctive dress preserved. Their presence at court must have influenced fashion, tactics, and even the self-image of Egypt's military elite. By adopting foreigners into the heart of their defense, the pharaohs acknowledged both the diversity and the fragility of their position. In hindsight, Ramesses's reign can be seen as a high point, a brilliant peak before decline. The monuments he raised still stand, speaking of wealth and confidence, but his empire was stretched thin. Wars against the Hittites, campaigns in Nubia, and confrontations with Libyan tribes consumed Egypt's energies. The pharaoh had checked the Sherden for now, but he had not resolved the deeper challenge they represented. The rise of mobile, seafaring peoples whose hunger for land and wealth could not be easily contained. As the long reign of Ramesses drew to a close, Egypt remained outwardly secure, its borders defended, its temples flourishing. Yet the seeds of future crisis had already been sown. The Sherden were no longer distant raiders, but part of Egypt's own fabric. Their presence foreshadowed the coming age, when wave after wave of seafarers would press harder against the Nile Delta. When later generations looked back, they saw in Ramesses' encounters with the Sherden the opening chapter of a much larger story. Egypt had won its battles, but it had not ended the threat. Instead, it had absorbed it, leaving to future pharaohs the task of facing the full force of the Sea People's advance. As the long reign of Ramesses II ended, Egypt passed into the hands of his successor, Meremptah. Though he ruled for only a decade, his reign carried enormous weight. It was during his time that the Sea Peoples first appeared, not merely as scattered raiders or mercenaries, but as part of organized coalitions aligned with Libyan tribes pressing against Egypt's western frontier. What had once been an intermittent nuisance now grew into a grave threat that tested the strength of the Nile Kingdom to its limits. The western desert, stretching beyond the fertile delta, was never truly empty. Tribes wandered its oases, herding livestock and raiding settled lands when opportunity arose. Among them were the Libu, a confederation of clans who had long watched Egypt's wealth with envy. Their mobility and knowledge of the desert made them dangerous foes, difficult to pin down in battle. For centuries, Egyptian armies had repelled them, pushing them back with punitive expeditions. But around 1209 BC, the Libu returned in force, this time with allies not from the sands, but from across the sea. Egyptian inscriptions describe the coalition vividly. The Libu were joined by the Peleset, Tjeker, and Shekelesh, names that would later resound in the annals of the Sea People's invasions. These groups had travelled from distant coasts, bringing wives, children, and flocks with them. No longer were they pirates seeking loot and flight. They were settlers on the move, pressing into Egypt itself with the aim of seizing land. The confrontation came in the western delta. Meremptah, though already advanced in age, marshalled his armies swiftly. Chariots rolled across the plains, infantry formed tight ranks, and archers strung bows beneath the burning sun. The clash was fierce. Egyptian reliefs boast of thousands of enemies slain, their severed hands piled before the pharaoh as proof of victory. Captives were paraded in chains, their distinctive headdresses and weaponry marking them as foreigners from across the Mediterranean. Meremptah's triumph was proclaimed on stone. The inscriptions describe Egypt's enemies as utterly shattered, their ambitions crushed by divine favor and royal might. One stele, erected at Thebes, goes further, boasting not only of victory over the Libu and their allies, but also of campaigns in Canaan. It is on this monument, the Israel Stele, that the word Israel appears for the first time in recorded history, naming a people living in the highlands of the Levant. In the same breath that celebrated Egypt's defense, the stele revealed a world in chaos with shifting peoples and rising powers far beyond the delta. Behind the triumphal words, however, lay troubling realities. Egypt had indeed won, but the scale of the invasion revealed how deeply the balance of power had shifted. The Libu and their seafaring allies had not come merely to raid. They brought their families, livestock, and entire communities. Their intent was to settle Egypt's fertile lands, not simply plunder and depart. That they could reach the delta in such numbers at all demonstrated the collapse of the old barriers. The Hittite Empire, which once balanced Egypt's northern frontier, had already fallen silent. Ugarit and other ports lay in ruins. With these buffers gone, Egypt faced the wandering tides directly. The cost of defense grew heavy. Mobilizing armies drained the royal treasury, while the constant threat along the western border disrupted agriculture. Farmers lived in fear of sudden raids, and caravans carrying tribute from Canaan faced delays. grain prices rose, a sure sign of strain. Even the victory itself brought no lasting peace, for new waves of migrants continued to push against the frontier. Life in Egyptian garrisons along the western edge must have been tense. Soldiers patrolled the desert margins, watching for dust clouds that marked approaching herders. Scouts carried reports of foreign camps rising in oases. Villagers fortified their homes and temples, relying on distant Thebes to send troops in time. Though the pharaoh's inscriptions boasted of total control, the reality for those who lived on the border was one of constant vigilance and fear. The Sea People's role in these wars marked a turning point. No longer confined to raids against coastal shipping, they now appeared deep in the delta, allied with Libyan tribes in large-scale invasions. Their participation revealed how far their migrations had advanced. The Peleset, later known as Philistines, fought alongside the Lebu. The Tjeker and Shekelesh also stood in the coalition. These were not mercenaries temporarily in Egyptian pay, but independent groups carving out their own futures. Their presence foreshadowed the permanent settlements they would later establish in Canaan. The Israel stele itself illustrates how entangled Egypt had become in the upheaval. While celebrating victory at home, it simultaneously acknowledged that new peoples were rising in lands Egypt once dominated. The mention of Israel, a small tribal confederation in the hill country, suggests that Egyptian control over Canaan was fraying. Cities might still pay tribute, but nomadic groups and settlers were asserting themselves in ways the pharaohs could not fully suppress. For the Egyptian court, Meremptar's campaigns offered reassurance that the gods still favored the throne. Priests held festivals of thanksgiving, praising the pharaoh for defending the two lands. Yet within living memory, Egyptians had seen Sherden bodyguards standing in Ramesses' courts, and now they faced the Peleset and Tjeker at their very gates. Victory could not conceal the uncomfortable truth. The Sea Peoples were no longer a distant nuisance, but a force moving closer with each generation. In the years after Meremptar's death, Egypt's position weakened further. His successors faced internal strife and short reigns, leaving the throne vulnerable at a moment when unity was most needed. Libyan tribes, undeterred by earlier defeats, renewed their pressure. The Sea Peoples continued to gather strength, their ships ranging wider, their coalitions swelling with fresh migrants from collapsing lands to the north and west. The Libyan wars thus marked more than a single episode of conflict. They revealed a new pattern of threat, migrations of whole peoples, not just warriors, pressing into settled lands. Egypt's victories delayed the tide, but did not reverse it. Each confrontation drained resources, unsettled provinces, and chipped away at the aura of invincibility that had long surrounded the pharaohs. Ordinary Egyptians must have sensed the change. Farmers in the delta endured the march of armies across their fields, losing crops to soldiers and invaders alike. Craftsmen struggled as trade routes faltered, reducing demand for luxury goods. Priests watched offerings dwindle as resources were diverted to defense. Though the monuments declared triumph, daily life carried the weight of insecurity. By the close of the 12th century BC, the stage was set for an even greater storm. The Lebu and their allies had shown that Egypt could be challenged within its own borders. The Sea Peoples had proven their capacity to unite with others, move in vast numbers, and threaten the Nile Kingdom itself. The victories of Meremptar had postponed disaster, but not prevented it. Soon, during the reign of Ramesses III, Egypt would face the largest and most devastating onslaught of all, the invasion of 1177 BC, remembered in carved reliefs as the pharaoh's desperate struggle to save his land from the empire breakers. The reign of Ramesses III opened with promise. Though not of the same towering fame as his predecessor Ramesses II, he ruled a still mighty Egypt. Temples rose in his honor, and his court maintained the old rhythms of tribute, offerings, and festivals. Yet beyond the Nile, the Mediterranean world burned. Palaces in Greece lay in ruins, the Hittite Empire had collapsed, and the Levantine ports were abandoned or aflame. From this chaos came the largest migration yet of the Sea Peoples, a coalition so vast that it threatened the very survival of Egypt. Egyptian records describe this invasion with unmatched detail. At Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III, vast reliefs spread across the walls, showing the drama in carved stone. There, lines of foreign warriors advance, their families following in ox-drawn carts, their ships crowding the sea with high prows and rows of oars. Against them stand Egypt's armies, archers with drawn bows, chariots racing across the plains, and Pharaoh himself larger than life, smiting enemies before the gods. The coalition of the Sea Peoples was immense. Egyptian texts name them the Peleset, Tjeker, Denyen, Sherden, and Weshesh. Each had its own origin, its own story of migration, yet in this moment they united in pursuit of new lands. They had swept through Syria, crushing what remained of Hittite power, and now turned toward Egypt. Their strategy was bold. One force marched overland through Canaan, while another sailed along the coast to strike the Nile Delta directly. Ramesses met the threat with determination. He fortified the delta, stockpiled grain, and called forth every soldier available. Scouts tracked enemy movements, while scribes prepared records of the campaign that would later be carved in stone. When the invaders arrived, Egypt was ready. The land battle came first. Sea People's armies, heavy with wagons and families, pushed south from Syria into Egyptian territory. Their warriors carried long swords, javelins, and distinctive round shields. Egyptian chariots met them in the open fields of the delta. Horses thundered, arrows darkened the sky, and the clash of bronze on bronze echoed across the plain. Reliefs at Medinet Habu show scenes of chaos, foreigners falling beneath Egyptian chariots, their carts overturned, their families caught in the struggle. Though the fighting was brutal, the Egyptians held firm. Ramesses claimed thousands of slain enemies, their bodies counted in grisly heaps as proof of victory. The naval battle proved even more dramatic. Egyptian scribes described the Sea People's fleet sailing boldly into the delta's mouths, confident of victory. Their ships, broad and high-sided, carried both warriors and settlers. Ramesses had prepared a trap. Egyptian vessels, sleeker and designed for maneuver within the river's channels, waited in ambush. From the banks, archers loosed volleys of arrows, while from the water, Egyptian ships rammed their enemies. Reliefs depict the invaders' boats capsized, their warriors thrown into the water, spears striking them as they struggled to swim. Women and children appear in the carvings too, reminders that this was no mere raiding party, but a migrating people caught in battle. Egypt triumphed. The invaders who survived were captured and settled as prisoners. Their dreams of seizing the Nile Delta dashed. Ramesses proclaimed himself the savior of Egypt, the chosen of the gods who had preserved the two lands from annihilation. At Medinet Habu, his inscriptions ring with pride. Those who came to attack my frontier, their seed is not. Their hearts and their souls are finished forever. Yet behind the triumph lay devastation. Though Egypt had survived, it did so at immense cost. The scale of the invasion revealed how deeply the Bronze Age world had collapsed. No single kingdom had been able to halt the migrations. Egypt alone had stood in their path. The victory was real, but it was defensive, desperate, and bloody. Far from expanding, Egypt now struggled merely to hold what it had. The people of the Nile Delta bore the scars. Fields were trampled by armies, villages destroyed, and families displaced. Even in victory, the burden fell upon ordinary Egyptians who rebuilt homes, redug canals, and struggled to restore the rhythms of life. Captives from the defeated peoples were resettled in garrisons and colonies, altering the demographics of the Delta and Canaan. These new communities, though under Egyptian control, carried their traditions and identities with them, planting the seeds of future societies that would shape the Iron Age. For Ramesses, the invasion became the defining moment of his reign. He cast himself as the last great defender of Egypt, the pharaoh who had turned back the tide when all other kingdoms had fallen. His temple at Medinet Habu, covered in vivid scenes of battle, served as a monument not only to his personal glory, but also to the turning of an age. Here, carved in stone, is the last great victory of the new kingdom. The catastrophe of 1177 BC reverberated far beyond Egypt. To the north, the Hittite Empire was already gone. To the west, Greece lay in ruins. To the east, the Levant had been reshaped by destruction and migration. Egypt had stood, but it emerged battered, its resources strained, its glory dimmed. The sea peoples had been checked, but they had not vanished. Some were absorbed into Egypt's society, others settled in Canaan, and still others scattered across the Mediterranean. Later generations would look back on this moment as the hinge of history. It marked the end of the interconnected Bronze Age world and the beginning of a harsher, fragmented Iron Age. Egypt's victory preserved its independence, but could not restore the old order. The networks of trade, diplomacy, and empire that had once sustained the Mediterranean were gone, never to return in the same form. Ramesses III stood triumphant, but his triumph was a warning. Even the strongest pharaoh could no longer project power abroad as his ancestors had done. Egypt had defended itself, yet it now turned inward, struggling to recover from the cost of survival. In the silence left by fallen empires, new powers would soon rise. The Philistines in the Levant, the Phoenicians along the coast, and the Israelites in the hill country. The catastrophe of 1177 BC was not only an invasion repelled, it was the death knell of the Bronze Age. The roar of battle faded, but the weight of survival lingered heavily over Egypt. Ramesses III had triumphed at the Delta, preserving his kingdom against the great tide of the sea peoples. Yet victory did not restore the empire's former glory. What followed was not a return to prosperity, but years of strain, hardship, and slow decline. The invaders had been repelled, but the damage they inflicted, combined with the wider collapse of the Bronze Age, left the land of the Nile weakened and vulnerable. Captives from the defeated coalition were not executed en masse. Instead, many were resettled. Some were placed in military colonies within the Delta, tasked with guarding Egypt's borders. Others were dispatched to Canaan, where Egyptian garrisons had long monitored rebellious towns. Here, the newcomers became both soldiers and settlers, a living reminder of the pharaoh's victory, but also a permanent alteration of the region's population. Families who had once followed war bands now tilled fields under Egyptian oversight, their presence marking the beginning of a new cultural landscape in the Levant. For Egyptians, the settlement of these foreigners was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it reinforced control over border regions, providing fresh manpower for defense. On the other, it strained already limited resources. Grain that once filled temples and granaries now had to feed thousands of captives. Land once worked by Egyptian farmers was redistributed to immigrant communities under military administration. In a kingdom already pressed by declining harvests and disrupted trade, the cost was keenly felt. The economy, once fueled by a vast network of Mediterranean exchange, now sputtered. The collapse of Ugarit, the fall of the Hittites, and the ruin of Mycenaean Greece meant fewer foreign luxuries entered Egyptian ports. Bronze production declined as supplies of tin became irregular. Workshops that once crafted weapons and tools in abundance slowed their output. While Egypt retained access to its own gold and grain, the broader prosperity of the New Kingdom era had vanished. This strain became visible in the lives of ordinary workers. At Deir el-Medina, a village of artisans employed to build royal tombs, records preserve the voices of men who endured shortages. They complained of delayed rations, of families left hungry, of payments withheld. At one point, laborers organized what may be the first recorded strike in history, refusing to continue work until they received their due grain. Such unrest, carved onto ostraca and papyri, reveals how deeply the state's resources had been stretched. Corruption compounded the crisis. Officials siphoned goods, delayed deliveries, and enriched themselves while common people suffered. Inscriptions that once boasted of Egypt's abundance now rang hollow against the realities of scarcity. Temples, though still maintained, no longer overflowed with offerings. The grandeur of the New Kingdom lived on in stone, but behind the facades lay fatigue and discontent. The army, too, changed in character. With Sherden guards already serving in royal courts and new groups of captives integrated into garrisons, Egypt's military became increasingly diverse. Foreign warriors played essential roles in defending the state, yet reliance on outsiders carried risks. Loyalty purchased through settlement and pay was not always secure. Over time, these communities retained elements of their identity, subtly shifting the cultural makeup of the Delta and Canaan. In the Levant, the consequences were profound. Egyptian power there had always rested on fragile foundations: garrisons, vassal treaties, and the prestige of the pharaoh's name. Now, with Egypt weakened, its hold slipped further. Foreign settlers, especially the Peleset and Tjeker, established themselves firmly along the southern coast. Though nominally under Egyptian oversight, their independence grew steadily. The remains reveal pottery styles and building forms that echo influences from the Aegean world and further afield. What began as captive resettlement evolved into the birth of new communities that would one day challenge Egyptian authority directly. Within Egypt itself, the court of Ramesses III celebrated his victories in elaborate ceremonies. Festivals proclaimed divine favor, and Medinet Habu's reliefs immortalized the pharaoh as the defender of the two lands. Yet even as monuments glorified the king, daily governance faltered. Successors after him would inherit not a flourishing empire, but a realm struggling to manage its own resources. The brilliance of the New Kingdom had reached its last great moment. Decline had already set in. For villagers along the Nile, the aftermath meant harder toil. Canals required constant repair after armies trampled fields. Herds had been seized or lost during the war, leaving farmers to rebuild flocks. Taxes remained high, for the state needed revenue to feed soldiers and maintain temples. In the Delta, coexistence with resettled foreigners created tensions. Differences in language, custom, and religion mark the newcomers. And though many integrated over generations, in these early decades, their presence was felt as both burden and reminder of Egypt's brush with disaster. Religious life adapted to the crisis. Priests emphasized rituals of protection, invoking the gods to shield Egypt from chaos. Processions carried statues of deities through city streets, reinforcing the idea that divine power had saved the land from invaders. Yet faith could not mask the reality of shortages. Even temples received fewer offerings, their storerooms less stocked than in earlier reigns. This weakening of temple wealth foreshadowed future struggles, as priests gained influence while pharaohs struggled to sustain grandeur. Despite these challenges, Egypt did not collapse as others had. The resilience of the Nile Valley itself, its dependable floods, its fertile soil, sustained the population when external trade faltered. Unlike Mycenaean or Hattusa, Egypt retained a secure agricultural base. This stability allowed it to endure, though in diminished form. The kingdom no longer projected dominance across the Mediterranean, but it remained a cohesive state, able to survive while others vanished. By 1150 BC, however, the trajectory was clear. Egypt was a kingdom under strain, surviving but no longer expanding, defending rather than conquering. The memory of the Sea People's invasion lingered in songs and carvings, but the reality of their presence shaped everyday life. They were no longer simply enemies repelled. They had become neighbors, settlers, and in some cases Egyptians themselves. The aftershocks of the catastrophe continued to ripple outward. In the southern Levant, the Peleset grew into the Philistine cities that would dominate the coastal plain. In the delta, foreign soldiers guarded temples and palaces. In the hills of Canaan, Israelite tribes began to consolidate, their rise encouraged by the weakening of Egyptian control. The world that emerged bore little resemblance to the interconnected Bronze Age of centuries past. The aftermath of Ramesses III's victories thus stands as a paradox. Egypt had defeated the greatest invasion of its age, yet the triumph marked the beginning of its long decline. Survival came at the cost of prosperity. Glory was preserved in monuments, but everyday life told a story of shortages, corruption, and unease. The Sea Peoples had been checked, but they remained, reshaping the very lands they once sought to conquer. When later generations remembered this period, they saw it as the twilight of an age. Egypt endured, but the brilliance of its empire faded. The kingdom's focus turned inward, consumed by managing resources, settling foreigners, and maintaining order. Beyond its borders, new powers rose, filling the vacuum left by fallen empires. In this shifting world, the seeds of the Iron Age had been planted, watered by the blood and fire of the invasions. In the wake of Egypt's victory under Ramesses III, fragments of the defeated Sea Peoples scattered across the Mediterranean. Some were absorbed into Egyptian service, others vanished into distant migrations. Yet one group, the Peleset, found fertile ground along the southern coast of Canaan. Here, in the ruins left by war and collapse, they established themselves as a formidable new presence. Over the following decades, these settlers grew into a power remembered by neighbors and later chroniclers as the Philistines. The lands they entered were scarred by conflict. Egyptian garrisons still lingered in a few strongholds, but much of the region lay outside pharaonic control. Local Canaanite towns had suffered raids, famine, and shifting allegiances. Into this fractured landscape came the Peleset, bringing with them families, livestock, and traditions from the Aegean world. They did not remain transient migrants. They built houses, cultivated fields, and transformed themselves into a settled society. Their presence runs deep. At Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, and Gath, the 12th century BC left traces of a fresh culture taking hold. The last phase of Mycenaean pottery turns up in great numbers, carrying patterns that recall the art of Greece. Large, well-constructed houses follow architectural patterns from the Aegean, with broad courtyards and storage areas. Even diet shifted. Animal bones from Philistine layers show a taste for pork, setting them apart from neighboring Canaanites and Israelites. These details mark the Peleset not as passing raiders, but as settlers forging a distinct identity. At first, their survival depended on adaptation. They occupied coastal plains rich in grain and close to trade routes, but vulnerable to hostility from inland populations. Egyptians tolerated them as long as they did not threaten tribute, and Canaanite towns alternately resisted or allied with them. Slowly, through persistence and military strength, the Peleset carved out 5 principal cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Together, these formed a loose confederation, remembered later as the Philistine Pentapolis. Their rise coincided with the decline of Egyptian authority in the Levant. Pharaohs after Ramesses III lacked the resources to maintain strong garrisons. Tribute from Canaan dwindled, and Egypt retreated into its own affairs. The vacuum left behind allowed the Philistines to flourish unchecked. Freed from constant Egyptian oversight, they fortified their cities, expanded their fields, and developed trade networks across the sea. Conflict with neighboring peoples soon followed. To the north and east, Canaanite city-states watched uneasily as Philistine power expanded. In the hill country, emerging Israelite tribes clashed with them repeatedly, as later biblical traditions would emphasize. While these texts preserve memory in legendary form, traces supports the picture of conflict. Burned layers in certain towns and shifts in settlement patterns suggest struggles between highland and lowland populations. The Philistines themselves brought military innovations that set them apart. They favored long, slashing swords of Aegean design, round shields, and distinctive feathered headdresses depicted in Egyptian reliefs. Their warriors fought in tight formations, and their fortified cities provided strong defensive bases. Against less organized groups, this combination proved formidable. Their reputation for strength grew rapidly, ensuring that they were both feared and respected by their neighbors. Trade remained central to their success. Positioned along the coast, the Philistines controlled access to maritime routes linking Egypt, Cyprus, and Phoenician ports to the north. Their harbors welcomed merchants, and their artisans produced goods prized in surrounding regions. Pottery, textiles, and metalwork spread from Philistine cities into inland markets. Over time, their economy grew resilient, balancing agriculture with seaborne exchange. Yet their society was not entirely foreign. While they carried traditions from the Aegean, they also absorbed local influences. Canaanite deities found place in their pantheon, and their pottery evolved from imported styles to unique hybrids. Intermarriage, trade, and diplomacy blended cultures. Within a few generations, the Philistines were no longer simply sea peoples. They had become a Levantine power with a distinct identity of their own. Daily life in their cities reflected this mixture. In Ashdod, excavations uncovered large storage jars filled with grain, evidence of organized surplus management. In Ekron, olive presses reveal industrial-scale production, making the city a hub of oil trade. At Ashkelon, houses contained both imported luxury goods and locally crafted wares, showing the blend of foreign and native traditions. These cities thrived not only as military strongholds, but as centers of agriculture, craft, and commerce. Their political organization remains less clear. The 5 cities appear to have operated as independent yet allied centers, cooperating in times of war but maintaining autonomy in daily affairs. Later texts describe lords of the Philistines, suggesting a ruling elite in each city who could act jointly when needed. This loose confederation allowed flexibility, enabling them to respond quickly to threats while avoiding the burdens of a single monarch. Relations with Egypt grew increasingly distant. While early settlement may have been tolerated under Egyptian oversight, by the 12th century BC, the pharaohs had little capacity to enforce authority in Canaan. The Philistines filled the void, exerting their influence across the southern Levant. Egyptian inscriptions ceased to mention them as enemies after the reign of Ramesses III, a silence that reflects both Egypt's retreat and the Philistines' firm establishment. Conflict with Israelite tribes, however, grew sharper. The highland groups, still forming their identity, often clashed with the powerful cities of the plain. Later biblical stories of Samson, Saul, and David reflect these struggles in legendary form. While the exact details cannot be confirmed archaeologically, the tension between inland tribes and coastal cities is consistent with the evidence of settlement and fortification. For the Israelites, the Philistines became the archetypal foe, a memory preserved for centuries. The rise of the Philistines marked a turning point in Levantine history. They represented the transformation of the sea peoples from wandering raiders into settled powers. Their establishment of the Pentapolis created a lasting political and cultural presence, one that would shape the Iron Age for centuries. In them, the chaotic migrations of the 12th century found permanence, rooted in stone walls and fertile fields. By 1100 BC, the Philistine cities stood as strongholds along the coast, thriving despite the collapse of older empires. Their pottery, architecture, and trade bear witness to a society that combined old Aegean traditions with new Levantine realities. They were no longer outsiders. They were now part of the fabric of the Eastern Mediterranean, both product and cause of the great upheavals that had shattered the Bronze Age. The Peleset had begun as wanderers, allies of Libyan tribes and enemies of Egypt. Through fire and defeat, they had transformed themselves into builders, rulers, and merchants. Their story illustrates the larger transformation of the sea peoples, from storm on the sea to enduring powers on land. As the Philistines rose, other groups, the Tjeker, Sherden, and Denyen, pursued their own destinies, leaving their marks across the coasts and islands of the Mediterranean. Their tales would follow, each one a fragment of the wider legacy of the sea peoples. When the storms of migration swept across the Mediterranean, not all groups settled in the same way. While the Peleset carved out their Pentapolis in the southern Levant, another branch of the sea peoples sought dominion further north. This group, known in Egyptian inscriptions as the Tjeker, established themselves on the coast at Dor, a port that would become their stronghold and the center of their maritime ambitions. The site of Dor was well chosen. Perched on a promontory along the Carmel coast, it commanded access to fertile hinterlands, abundant fisheries, and key shipping lanes. For centuries before the Tjeker arrived, Canaanite merchants had prospered here, linking inland valleys with maritime routes that stretched to Cyprus and Egypt. The upheavals of the 12th century BC left the town vulnerable. When the Tjekers settled at Dor, they stepped into a vacuum of power, fortifying the city and transforming it into a hub of their own. Excavations reveal their presence vividly. Massive defensive walls rose around Dor during this period, enclosing storehouses, workshops, and dwellings. Pottery styles show strong connections to Aegean traditions, much like the material culture of the Philistines, though blended with local Canaanite elements. Tools, weaponry, and domestic wares display a mix of origins, reflecting both imported skills an adaptation to Levantine life. These findings align closely with Egyptian accounts that describe the Tjeker as prominent players in the coastal world of the 12th century BC. Their maritime orientation shaped their identity. Whereas the Philistines relied heavily on farming and inland trade, the Tjeker turned the sea into their lifeline. They sailed north to Cyprus, west to Anatolia, and south toward Egypt, carrying goods and occasionally launching raids. Control of Dor gave them both security on land and freedom at sea, a balance that allowed them to flourish as coastal lords during an age of collapse. Relations with neighbors were complex. To the south, the Philistine cities expanded their influence. To the north, Phoenician towns such as Tyre and Sidon began their rise. Between them, the Tjeker held Dor, competing and cooperating as circumstances demanded. In some seasons, they traded olive oil, wine, and metalwork with their neighbors. In others, they likely contested harbors and sea lanes, their ships clashing with rivals who sought the same spoils of commerce. Egyptian texts from the reign of Ramesses III mention the Tjeker among the peoples defeated during the Great Invasion of 1177 BC. Yet unlike other groups, the Tjeker clearly endured and prospered afterward, suggesting that they quickly shifted from wandering to settlement. Egyptian authority in Canaan weakened steadily during this time, leaving little to restrain their expansion. By the mid-12th century, Dor stood firmly in their hands, a city that symbolized their resilience and ambition. Daily life within Dor under the Tjeker reveals both continuity and change. Houses followed Canaanite patterns, but included features familiar from Aegean architecture. Storage jars filled with grain and oil suggest organized surplus, while fishing equipment reflects the exploitation of nearby waters. Burial customs display a blend of practices, with tombs containing both local artifacts and imported goods. Such hybridity underscores the transformation of the Tjeker from outsiders into a community firmly rooted in the Levant. Their role in regional politics grew steadily. From Dor, they could influence inland trade routes that connected to the Jezreel Valley and beyond. Merchants from the highlands sought access to Mediterranean markets, and the Tjeker positioned themselves as gatekeepers. Control of such routes brought wealth, but also conflict, as rival towns resented their dominance. Skirmishes and shifting alliances were likely common, though the archaeological record provides only glimpses of these struggles. The rise of the Tjeker also reflects a broader pattern. Across the Mediterranean, the sea peoples who survived Egypt's defenses found new homes. The Peleset dominated the southern coast, the Sherdens settled in far-flung islands, and the Tjeker established their power at Dor. Each adapted to local conditions, but all shared a legacy of migration, resilience, and ambition. In this way, the sea peoples ceased to be merely destroyers. They became builders of new societies in the ruins of the Bronze Age. For Egypt, the presence of the Tjeker posed both threat and inconvenience. Though Ramesses III had celebrated his victories, his successors lacked the strength to enforce control in northern Canaan. Duarta and other coastal towns slipped beyond Egyptian influence. While not openly hostile, the Tjeker represented a challenge to Egypt's prestige, a visible sign that foreign settlers now ruled lands once bound by tribute. The Phoenicians, too, faced competition. As Tyre and Sidon expanded into seafaring powers, they contended with the Tjeker for dominance of coastal trade. Over time, the Phoenicians would eclipse them, but in these early decades, Dor's power was formidable. The rivalry between these groups foreshadowed the vibrant yet contested maritime culture of the Iron Age Levant. Legends may preserve distant memories of the Tjeker's role. Some later traditions hint at foreign rulers in Dor, powerful lords who commanded fleets and demanded tribute. While these echoes cannot be confirmed, they align with the archaeological and textual evidence of a strong maritime presence centered on the city. The Tjeker, though less famous than the Philistines, left an imprint on the coastal landscape that endured for generations. By the close of the 12th century BC, Dor had become one of the key fortified ports of the Levant. Its walls testified to both fear and ambition, built to resist enemies and to proclaim authority. Within those walls lived a community that blended Aegean roots with Levantine soil, a society born of migration, yet firmly anchored in its new homeland. The Tjeker had secured their place, transforming from wandering raiders into coastal lords. Their story illustrates the adaptability of the sea peoples as a whole. Defeated in their attempt to conquer Egypt, they redirected their energies towards settlement. Where once they threatened the great empires of the Bronze Age, they now carved out smaller, resilient polities that would endure into the Iron Age. Dor stands as a symbol of this transformation, a city once Canaanite, then seized by migrants and finally shaped into a maritime stronghold by newcomers determined to survive. In the generations that followed, the Tjeker would fade into the fabric of Levantine history, overshadowed by the rise of the Phoenicians and the enduring power of the Philistine cities. Yet their presence at Dor marked an important chapter in the saga of the Sea Peoples. It showed that even amid collapse, new societies could emerge, rooted in resilience and ambition. The coastal lords of Dor may not have ruled empires, but they embodied the spirit of survival that defined the age. As the Philistines entrenched themselves in the southern Levant and the Tjeker held Dor, other branches of the Sea Peoples scattered more widely. Their paths stretched across the Mediterranean, shaping islands and coastlines from Sicily to Anatolia. Among the most distinctive were the Sherden, the Shekelesh, and the Denyen, groups remembered in Egyptian inscriptions and hinted at in archaeology. Their stories show how the Great Migrations did not end with Egypt's defense, but continued to reshape the wider world. The Sherden had first appeared as pirates, striking Egyptian coasts in the days of Ramesses II. Captured warriors became bodyguards in pharaonic courts, their horned helmets and round shields immortalized in reliefs. Yet their origins seem to lie farther west. Scholars have long noted similarities between Sherden armor and the warrior culture of Nuragic Sardinia. On that island, massive stone towers, known as nuraghe, dotted the landscape, defensive structures built by communities skilled in both warfare and seafaring. The resemblance suggests a connection. Perhaps migrants from Sardinia joined the great movement of the Sea Peoples, or perhaps defeated Sherden returned to the island after Egyptian campaigns. Whatever the precise link, traces of their identity endure in Sardinia's Bronze Age. The Shekelesh, too, appear to have roots in the western Mediterranean. Egyptian records list them among the enemies defeated by Meremptah and Ramesses III. Their name echoes that of Sicily, where warrior traditions and fortified settlements flourished in the late 2nd millennium BC. In Sicily, like Sardinia, archaeologists find evidence of upheaval, burned sites, shifting populations, and new weapon styles. The Shekelesh may have been part of this turmoil, venturing eastward with the larger coalition of the Sea Peoples, before some returned to their homeland or settled along foreign coasts. The Denyen offer another tantalizing connection. Their name resembles the Danans of later Greek tradition, one of the collective names Homer used for the warriors at Troy. Egyptian reliefs depict them with feathered helmets, similar to other sea peoples, while inscriptions place them in the coalition that struck Egypt in 1177 BC. Their presence suggests that warriors from the Aegean, perhaps displaced Mycenaeans, joined the Great Migrations. If so, the Denyen may preserve a memory of Greek fighters who, after the fall of their palaces, took to the sea in search of new homes. Where these groups ultimately settled remains difficult to trace, but hints survive. In Sardinia, Nuragic culture absorbed foreign influences during this period, adopting new weapon styles and decorative motifs. In Sicily, layers of material reveal ties to both Aegean and Levantine cultures, as if migrants from east and west had converged there. Along the Levantine coast, scattered finds of Aegean-style pottery suggest that not all Denyen remained in Greece. Some joined the new coastal societies of the eastern Mediterranean. What unites these stories is transformation. The Sea Peoples began as raiders, feared for their sudden strikes, but in the aftermath of their defeats, they became settlers. Sardinia and Sicily absorbed migrants who left lasting marks on their architecture and weaponry. The Levant incorporated Philistines, Tjeker, and Denyen, blending them into new Iron Age cultures. Even Egypt, though victorious, hosted communities of Sherden and other foreigners within its borders. Across the Mediterranean, the invaders became neighbors, their identities reshaped by adaptation and assimilation. Their presence altered trade. Sardinia's copper, Sicily's grain, and Levantine oil now moved through channels influenced by these migrant groups. Ships once feared as pirate vessels became carriers of legitimate exchange. The networks of the Bronze Age had collapsed, but new routes emerged, stitched together by peoples who had once been outsiders. Legends preserved echoes of their journeys. Greek poets told of heroes wandering after the Trojan War, their fleets scattered across the seas. Stories of Odysseus encountering strange lands, or of Aeneas sailing west to Italy, may carry faint memories of real migrations. In biblical texts, the Philistines appear as foes of Israel, their origins dimly remembered as foreign. Egyptian inscriptions, carved in stone, celebrated victories over the Sherden, Shekelesh, and Denyen. But in reality, these peoples endured, reshaping regions far from the Nile. Life within their new homelands reflected both continuity and change. In Sardinia, the nuraghe remained central, but new weapons and pottery styles appeared. In Sicily, fortified villages grew larger, suggesting increased competition and external influence. In the Levant, Denyen warriors integrated into societies that blended Canaanite and Aegean traditions. Each community adapted to local conditions, but all carried the legacy of migration and survival. For the Mediterranean as a whole, their dispersal marked the end of a unified Bronze Age and the beginning of a fragmented Iron Age. Instead of a few great empires dominating the region, numerous smaller powers rose, each shaped by the movements of peoples like the Sherden, Shekelesh, and Denyen. Trade became more localized, warfare more frequent, and cultures more diverse. Egypt, though weakened, still remembered these groups with unease. Inscriptions continued to list their names, reminders of the great invasions. Yet Egypt no longer sought to destroy them. Instead, the pharaohs tolerated their presence, even employed them in garrisons, recognizing that the new order of the world could not be undone. By 1050 BC, the Sea Peoples were no longer a storm crashing upon the gates of empires. They had become part of the Mediterranean landscape. Farmers in Sardinia, warriors in Sicily, merchants in Levantine ports. Their scattering ensured that no single identity remained intact. Instead, They blended with locals, creating hybrid cultures that bore traces of their origins. The horned helmets and feathered crests of Egyptian reliefs gave way to the more ordinary artifacts of daily life: pottery, houses, tools, and fields. The Sherden, Shekelesh, and Denyen thus embody the larger transformation of their age. From raiders to settlers, from terror to neighbors, they reveal how the collapse of empires produced not only destruction, but also renewal. The Bronze Age world had ended, but from its ashes rose new societies, each carrying fragments of the past into an uncertain future. By the dawn of the 11th century, BC, the old order of the Mediterranean was gone. The empires that once towered over the region had fallen or faded. The Hittite kings vanished from Anatolia, their capital reduced to charred ruins. Ugarit and other Levantine ports lay silent, their archives buried beneath ash. Even mighty Egypt, though still standing, now looked inward, drained by decades of war and unable to project power as it once had. Into this vacuum stepped new powers, smaller, more agile, forged in the crucible of collapse. On the Levantine coast, the Phoenician cities began their rise. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, though scarred by past upheaval, survived when others perished. Freed from Hittite and Egyptian dominance, these ports turned the sea into their highway. Their merchants rebuilt connections across the Mediterranean, sailing to Cyprus, Anatolia, and beyond. In doing so, they laid the foundations for a trading empire that would eventually stretch as far as Spain and North Africa. The Phoenicians inherited the maritime spirit of the age and transformed it into lasting economic power. Further south, the Philistines consolidated their strength. From Gaza to Gath, their 5 cities flourished as centers of agriculture, craftsmanship, and trade. Prosperity left its mark in the form of storage complexes, industrial presses for oil, and sturdy fortifications. Distinctive pottery styles and architecture show their Aegean roots, but over generations they blended with local traditions. By 1100 BC, they were firmly established as one of the dominant peoples of the southern Levant, rivals to both Canaanite towns and emerging Israelite tribes. In the highlands of Canaan, new settlements appeared. Villages spread across hilltops, modest in scale but numerous. These communities mark the early stages of what would later be remembered as Israel. Simple houses, terraced fields, and communal storage pits reflect a society of farmers carving stability from rugged terrain. Their rise owed much to the vacuum left by Egypt's retreat and the weakening of coastal powers. While Philistine lords ruled the plains, the highlands nurtured small groups who would one day forge kingdoms of their own. To the west, Cyprus also transformed. Once a hub of Bronze Age trade, the island adapted to new realities. Migrants from the Aegean and Levant mingled with local populations, creating hybrid cultures. Fortified sites guarded copper resources, and new pottery styles emerged that blended influences from multiple regions. Cyprus remained a vital link in Mediterranean trade, though now tied more closely to the networks of Phoenician and Philistine merchants than to distant empires. Even in Anatolia, where the Hittite capital lay in ruins, smaller states rose from the ashes. Neo-Hittite kingdoms such as Carchemish preserved fragments of the old traditions, carving inscriptions in Libyan hieroglyphs and building palaces on a reduced scale. These states lacked the might of their predecessors, but maintained cultural continuity, bridging the gap between the fallen Bronze Age and the rising Iron Age. The technological shift to iron further marked this new era. Bronze, once the lifeblood of armies and artisans, depended on scarce tin supplies that had become unreliable. Iron, though more difficult to work at first, offered a more abundant alternative. Across the Mediterranean, smiths experimented with the new metal, producing tools and weapons that gradually eclipsed bronze. This shift did not happen overnight, but by 1000 BC iron had become the hallmark of the age. The Sea People's migrations, combined with broader collapse, accelerated this transition by disrupting old supply chains and forcing societies to adapt. Memory of the great invasions lingered. Egyptian inscriptions still listed the names of the Sea Peoples, reminders of the battles fought by Ramesses III. In Canaan, tales of conflict with Philistines and other groups became woven into oral traditions later preserved in the Bible. Greek poets, too, sang of wandering heroes, perhaps echoing memories of displaced warriors from the Aegean. Though each culture remembered differently, all carried fragments of the upheaval that had ended the Bronze Age. For ordinary people, daily life in the Iron Age was both harsher and more localized. The grandeur of vast palaces and sprawling empires gave way to smaller communities. Farmers relied on terraced fields and communal storage rather than centralized redistribution. Villagers built simple fortifications instead of monumental walls. Trade networks still existed, but were narrower, focused on regional exchange rather than global reach. Yet this decentralization also brought resilience. Small communities could survive where vast empires had collapsed. The Phoenicians, Philistines, Israelites, and Neo-Hittite states each represent different responses to the same crisis. Some turned to the sea, mastering commerce and exploration. Others fortified fertile plains and built city-states. Still others carved livelihoods from highlands, slowly coalescing into tribes and kingdoms. The diversity of these responses created a patchwork of new powers, each shaped by the legacy of the Sea Peoples and the destruction they had wrought. Religion, too, reflected change. In Philistine cities, gods from the Aegean mingled with Canaanite deities. In Phoenician temples, Baal and Astarte rose to prominence, their cults spreading across the Mediterranean with merchant ships. In the Israelite highlands, worship coalesced around a single god, laying the foundation for monotheism. The spiritual landscape of the region was as fragmented and dynamic as its political map. By 1000 BC, the Mediterranean world bore little resemblance to the one that had flourished centuries earlier. The great empires were gone, their ruins scattered across hills and coasts. In their place stood a mosaic of smaller states and peoples, each carrying pieces of the old world into the new. The Sea Peoples had been catalysts of this transformation. Though their invasions brought destruction, their settlements and assimilation created the foundations of Iron Age societies. The legacy of these migrations was thus twofold: devastation and renewal. The collapse of palaces, cities, and empires shattered centuries of stability. Yet from those ruins rose new cultures: Phoenicians who would master the sea, Philistines who would dominate the coast, Israelites who would shape religion and history, and countless others who built anew. The Iron Age was born not in peace, but in fire, forged by the empire breakers whose memory lingered long after their sails vanished from the horizon. By the start of the first millennium BC, the storm of migrations had quieted. The Sea Peoples, once a tide crashing against the walls of empires, were no longer roving invaders. They had settled, assimilated, and become part of the patchwork of Iron Age societies. Yet their shadow lingered. For Egyptians, Israelites, Greeks, and countless others, the memory of these outsiders endured, woven into chronicles, myths, and legends. In Egypt, scribes continued to record their names. Temple inscriptions listed the Sherden, Shekelesh, Denyen, Tjeker, and Peleset as foes vanquished by Ramesses III. Carved in stone, these accounts proclaimed the triumph of Pharaoh over chaos. Yet the reality was more complex. Many of those enemies had been resettled within Egypt itself, serving in garrisons or farming lands granted by the crown. Their descendants lived as Egyptians, their origins remembered only through the monumental texts that branded them as foreigners. The victory narratives became less historical record and more political theatre, reinforcing the image of Pharaoh as eternal defender. To the peoples of the Levant, the memory of the sea peoples took other forms. The Philistines, firmly established in their 5 cities, became central figures in the traditions of their neighbors. Israelite stories cast them as rivals and oppressors, foes who tested tribal leaders and kings. Samson, Saul, and David all grappled with them in tales that blend history with legend. These stories, preserved in biblical texts, ensured that the Philistines would be remembered not merely as migrants, but as archetypal enemies in the shaping of Israelite identity. Further north, Phoenician sailors inherited both rivalry and kinship with other groups of sea peoples. The Tjeker at Dor competed for trade, but their presence also demonstrated the shared maritime culture of the Levant. As Tyre and Sidon expanded across the sea, memories of earlier migrations may have inspired their own ventures. The very idea of distant settlement, so central to Phoenician colonization, echoed the earlier wanderings of displaced seafarers. In the Aegean, legends of the Trojan War and its aftermath carried echoes of these migrations. Poets spoke of warriors unable to return home, of fleets scattered by storms, of heroes wandering foreign coasts. The Denyen, whose name recalls the Danaans of Homer, may reflect this tradition. Whether or not the tales preserve direct memories of the sea peoples, they certainly arose from the same world of displacement and wandering. To later Greeks, the age of heroes was one of both glory and loss, shaped by movements that also fueled the great invasions. Even in the Western Mediterranean, traces lingered. Sardinia's Nurage culture, Sicily's warrior settlements, and Italian traditions of seafaring all bear signs of interaction with migrants once linked to the sea peoples. The Sherden and Shekelesh, remembered in Egyptian texts, lived on not as foreign raiders, but as part of the cultural mosaic of these islands. The memory of their eastern campaigns faded, but their local identities endured. For centuries, the sea peoples were remembered less as individuals and more as a force of nature. Egyptian inscriptions portrayed them as a collective storm, coming from the midst of the sea, bringing fire and ruin. Biblical texts cast them as relentless adversaries. Greek myths transformed them into wandering heroes or monstrous foes. Across cultures, they became symbols of disruption, outsiders who challenged order and forced societies to adapt. Yet memory also softened with time. By the 10th century BC, the descendants of the sea peoples were not outsiders, but neighbors. Philistine merchants traded with Israelites and Phoenicians. Settlers in the delta tilled fields beside Egyptians. Communities in Sardinia and Sicily blended with locals, creating hybrid cultures. What had begun as invasion ended as assimilation. The very groups once feared as destroyers became part of the foundations of the Iron Age. For historians today, their story illustrates both destruction and renewal. They brought down empires, yet they also seeded new cultures. They burned cities, yet they built new ones. They ended the Bronze Age, but in doing so, they made possible the Iron Age world that followed. Without their migrations, the rise of Phoenician trade, Israelite kingdoms and Philistine power might have unfolded differently, or not at all. The endurance of their memory lies partly in mystery. We do not know their exact homelands, their full languages, or the details of their journeys. Fragments remain: pottery, weapons, fortifications, while texts preserve the names and the battles. But the full picture remains elusive, allowing later generations to fill the gaps with legend. In this way, the Sea Peoples live on not only in history, but also in imagination, their story reshaped by each culture that recalled them. Standing at Medinet Habu, where Ramesses III carved his triumph, one can see the paradox clearly. On the walls, Egypt's victory is eternal, the Sea Peoples forever defeated. Yet outside those walls, history tells a different tale. The Philistines rising, the Phoenicians expanding, the Israelites consolidating, the Sardinians and Sicilians carrying forward their traditions. The empire breaker was not destroyed, it was transformed. The 12th century's turmoil gradually gave way to a new balance. The Sea Peoples were no longer a wave-battering empires, but threads woven into diverse societies. Their descendants adopted local tongues, bowed to new kings, and prayed at different shrines. Yet the memory of their origins lingered in Egyptian reliefs, in Hebrew stories, in Greek songs, and in the silent ruins they had left behind. Their legacy shows that collapse is not simply destruction. The fall of the Bronze Age toppled palaces and shattered networks, but it also cleared space for new powers to emerge. The Philistine cities, the Phoenician harbors, and the highland tribes all carried fragments of the old world into the new. The Sea Peoples, once branded as outsiders, had become part of the foundation on which the Iron Age was built. So their saga does not end with disappearance, but with transformation. The empire breakers became neighbors and ancestors, their names surviving in stone and story, even as their sails vanished from the horizon. The storm had passed, but its mark endured, an altered Mediterranean, where from the ashes of collapse rose a harder, more resilient world.